Yeah, we'll be like that. Okay.
Our first item up is the Equity Committee update on Objective 3 graduation rates. We've got a handout, and
I don't know that we have the slides up.
We do. It's ready to roll when you are. Yep.
So you want to go? Or I can do the slides from there and you guys can come from here. Okay.
There you are. I don't push it. I will use it down there.
Sounds good. Well, hello again. Now in this new format, I'm Yolanda Rivera. I'm the chair of the Equity Committee, and thank you for inviting us to join. Hopefully this will be a good discussion tonight. Tonight we will be looking into Objective 3 of the Comprehensive Equity Plan with a focus on reducing disproportionality in graduation rates. We have studied several issues related to graduation, including the difference between graduation rates and dropout rates, and why we would look at 4-year and 5-year graduation rates. From our study, we have 3 key points that we want to share with you tonight, and for that, I'm going to let Jane begin.
Thanks again for having us. I'm Jane Finch. I'm a member of the committee. Our first point is our typical point, and that is the need for disaggregated data. Average graduation rates, mass rates among subgroups of students. The reason it's important to make this point is that the reports we know you have looked at did not disaggregate graduation rates. There was simply a line reporting the 1-year rate of 93.1% for the 2015-16 school year. We thought it would be useful to look at trend data over time and also at disaggregated, and indeed we found patterns worth exploring further, and we would like to offer you a sample of what we looked at. First, we suggest it's helpful to look at the data in graphic form as we have for you here tonight rather than just tables. In this case, we graphed the 2017 graduation rates by subgroups. The 4-year graduation rates for the district as a whole was 90.24%. That's represented on the red line at the top of the screen. The 4-year graduation, when you look at the data this way, you can more easily notice the rates that deviate from the district-wide average. First, we were struck by the graduation rates of the Hispanic students, which was 76%. Second, we noticed that students with IEPs had an even lower graduation rate at 67%. To investigate the issue deeper, we looked at disaggregated trend data over the past 5 years. We were able to see some improvements over time. For example, graduation rates for both African American students and students on free and reduced lunch have been on an upward trend, but we still see some concerning disparities. We want to show you in our short time today the specific data we looked at for Hispanic students and students with IEPs. Next slide. Once we saw the graduation rate data in chart form rather than just numbers, we next asked to see the rates over time. Here you see both the 4- and 5-year graduation rates for our district's Hispanic and Latinx students since the 2012 school year. The solid green bars are the 4-year graduation rates. The bars with the slanted black lines are the 5-year graduation rates. The first thing that strikes us is the 2017 graduation rates, and we wonder if this is an anomaly. When we see the rates over time, we do see quite a dip in 2017, from a high of 90% in 2016 to just 76% in 2017. We spent time thinking about what might have been happening with our Hispanic students 2 years ago, as well as what we might do to investigate this. This seems like it could be a fruitful line of inquiry for folks in the district office to take up. We also wondered whether there may be something about the data itself that caused this anomaly, like were there changes in the way that Hispanic students were identified? Was the number of Hispanic seniors significantly different this year from previous years, such that the rate would be more volatile? We did not actually have the numbers, just the rates, so we couldn't dig much deeper into the data ourselves. We suggest, therefore, that it seems important for someone to carry forward this line of inquiry and look at the data itself and how our Hispanic students might be faring given this dip in 2016 and 2017. The next area we dug into were our students on IEP and their graduation rate. Here, again, we saw several questions in the data worth investigating. First, the overall graduation rates for students with IEPs is woefully low. The percentage of students with IEPs graduating 4 years never exceeded 75% in the 5 years represented by this data. Second, the difference between the 4 and 5 year rate seems greater than students who have an IEP than with other subgroups. While the highest 4-year graduation rate was 75%, the 5-year graduation rate that year was nearly 82%. Knowing this may help us to think about supporting students with IEPs over time. Third, something appears to have happened in 2015 and 2016. Our first thought was that this may have been a year that identification of students for IEPs was adjusted. When we looked at the numbers, indeed, we did see that the rate was dramatically lower that year. This could have been a result of a policy change, or it could be a mistake in the data. We weren't able to answer these questions, so you may want to look into them for yourselves. Overall, we could see there is a possible upward trend in graduation rates for students with IEPs, which we're also seeing for other subgroups. However, what happened in 2015, 2016 may have interrupted that. 2016-17 may have gotten back on track, but the 4-year graduation rate that year was lower than in 2014 and 2015. It will be good to see what happens this year. Overall, we hope that these few slices of data demonstrate how instructive it can be to review disaggregated graduation rate data.
The next slide starts the second part of this presentation. The data we looked at, which you just seen, was one way into our graduation rate conversations. It only gives a glimpse of the numbers of students who graduate who do not. We also think it is important in the context of the Comprehensive Equity Plan to ask additional questions about the students who did not graduate. Who are they? What supports were offered before they graduated? Where are they now? We know there are several dropout prevention programs underway. If we had more time, we would have asked what they were and what evidence of impact there is around them. We also wonder what kinds of early warning systems we have in place in the high schools that allow for earlier interventions prior to dropping out, and how well they are working. Similarly, we have questions about students who do graduate. Simply graduating is not enough of an indication of whether the preparation we give to students in high school is adequate. Knowing how students are faring post-graduation would help us to know if our programming is preparing students to succeed in college and careers after high school. We think you might want to find out what data you already have that can answer these questions and what additional data we might need. For example, we might look at persistence data at Kirkwood Community College and at the University of Iowa. As the data we have seen about how African American males who enter Kirkwood Community College are resoundingly not able to complete their first year of study. What could we be doing better in our high schools to prepare them for post-secondary success? Secondly, you have data on what students aspire to do. And the vast majority of the students in this district aspire to go to college. However, not only do we know some subgroups of students are not achieving these goals, we also know anecdotally that some students of color are not getting guidance in junior high and high school about what they need to be doing in order to achieve their aspirations for a four-year college education. Our brief investigation into disproportionality in graduation rates begs these additional questions that point to what graduation rates cannot tell us. With that, our big takeaway is that while graduation rates are one useful data set, they are just one data set. They definitely need to be complemented with other indicators of student success and other information about the students who do and do not graduate. A good strategic plan should address these broader questions. What we shared tonight is just a sample of what we looked at, offered as a way to model what you as a board will want to do as you monitor implementation of the Comprehensive Equity Plan and achievement of your strategic goals. One outstanding question we have is, who is digging into the full battery of subgroup data like we started to do in order to identify patterns, trends, and anomalies? We are hopeful that this is precisely what an equity program manager who can work with data should be able to do. And this leads to two other questions. We realize that we also do not know what else these data, who else uses these data and how they use them. We don't know who ultimately is responsible for improving graduation rates. While that seems like a clear high school outcome, it also seems like there are lots of support programs and other parties who come into play when looking to improve graduation rates. Are there opportunities for our high school leaders to collaborate with program staff around the early identification of students at risk of dropping out? Do our high school teachers and leaders know what is needed for college and career success? These seem like good questions to be asking. Given what we looked into and all the questions that came up, we should like to recommend some next steps, some of which are by now familiar to you. First, there are some specific issues in the data we outlined tonight that are worth having someone look into. Jane talked about those specific issues. Secondly, we recommended that a task force spend some time thinking about how questions about graduation rates fit into a revised comprehensive equity plan. And we strongly suggest that those who are responsible for improving graduation rates be represented with such a task force. Yolanda's going to talk more about the task force idea in a minute. While we do not believe graduation rates are the most important measure of student outcomes, they are an important component of the overall picture of our district. Being thoughtful about what graduation rates can and cannot tell us and how else we measure things we care about would be time well spent by members of a task force. We also suggest the task force could be thinking about how the district can best use the comprehensive school improvement planning or CSIP process to drive actions that come out of a review like ours. Specifically, we wonder how both the district and all of the secondary schools incorporate reviews of graduation rates in their identification of issues to address in their CSIPs and as measures of school improvement. Finally, as a board, reviewing graduation rate data at a level at least as detailed as we just did is important to do each year, and to do so early enough in the summer that the findings can be used in planning for the coming year. You should not need to wait for the annual progress report to have someone digging into your measures of success. To that point, you will note that we did not have 2018 graduate data to discuss this evening. Though we believe those data may already have been reported to the state, it's not easy for the district staff to get to the data until they turn back to the district from the state. We don't understand that process, and again, we're hopeful the new equity program manager will be able to deliver those kinds of reports much sooner in the future. So kudos again for approving the new position.
So normally we would open for questions now. As you heard from the presentation, there were a lot of things we did not have data to dig into. But if you bear with us, and if you're waiting, we would like to talk a little bit more about one of our recommendations, which was the task force and what that might look like. So the committee decided to propose a task force to address the comprehensive equity plan, to update it. We've been saying this in most of our presentations, and the year has come. It's a 3-year plan, and we're on year 3, I believe. So at the end of this year, we really need to take another look and look at what worked, what didn't work, what modifications we need to make it work better and be a better assessment tool. So the task force would analyze the potential root causes of the disparities addressed in the current comprehensive equity plan and identify others that we may not have thought of before. Reframe the objectives and recommend expectations for improved outcomes, ways to measure whether we are making progress. Develop criteria to select district and school level strategies for improvements with examples so that it's easy for people to understand what it is they need to accomplish. Recommend a plan for monitoring the results. Supporting the task force would also help support the comprehensive school improvement planning process, advise how to have an equity lens when setting up the goals for the CSIP. The task for it to work, we think should work in subgroups because it would be big amount of different things that they would be looking at the same time. So maybe if they could work in different subgroups that could look at some of these topics. We feel like if it had a paid facilitator, researcher, writer that could devote time to keep it in track and keep monitoring it, it might help us move along. Task force should submit a report as soon as possible, but no later than March or April, so that the leaders can use the findings in their next CSIP process. It should be comprised of administrators who are responsible for implementing the components of the equity plan. Right now, different parts of the equity plans are designated to certain administrators. But again, in revising it, we should see what works best for each objective. Members of the equity committee, community members, teachers and staff, students, and a school board member. They should have a steering committee that can help those subgroups, and that steering committee, we believe, should have at least 2 members of the equity committee, should have the equity director be a part of it as well as one assistant superintendent, a principal or an assistant principal, just to get their point of view, student, a teacher, a student family advocate, or a student support service member staff. And the last one you can't see there, it says family member, and by that we mean a parent, a guide, someone that's in charge of a student, not necessarily a parent, but who can give their input into the process as well. Okay, and now, if you have any questions.
I just have a quick one. So when I look at what is proposed for the task force, and kind of what I brought up at the board meeting, the School Improvement Advisory Committee, I think some of that work, if not a lot of it, could fall under that committee if we really looked at our structure and what that committee's purpose is. And like I said, we'll probably have this discussion at a board meeting later, but if you look at what some of the other districts are doing around the state that are similar to us, it's much different than I feel our committee is having certain about it.
The school improvement committee, should be saying, ours is operating for other civil districts.
That's all.
We'd just like to make another comment, Janet, if it's okay. You may have noticed that we talked about graduation rate inequity data, but then we also talked about a task force. Okay? And the reason we talked about a task force is because I think in our way of thinking, the disparities in a number of areas in the district outcome now appear to us to be more complicated and more difficult to resolve than we can do by coming to you every month or so and talking about disparities and what can this and that. So we definitely think that the district needs to change the way we are trying to resolve the disparities into a much more formal process.
Right, I agree. And I appreciate, I want to thank you guys for all the work you put in this and everything. And I don't know if, was 2015 and 16 when the state came in and started doing things with special ed? Was it that year, Steve?
What's that?
I say with this IEP student graduation rate, the 2015-16 year, is that when the state came in?
Yeah, but it shouldn't have had anything to do with this, so I'm not,
Well, but I just, wasn't it that year that they?
It was.
Okay, just for clarification for myself, nothing else. And I think and I thought one of the points that you brought up as far as making sure that Black and Hispanic students are on the right track in high school taking those courses, so even the ones that maybe make it through to graduation? Are they on a path if college is what they want to do, that they've taken the prerequisites and things of that nature? That's where I think it's very important in junior high when students are planning out their high school plans, that there be a, if post-secondary and myself, I always like to frame it in, not everyone goes to college, but post-secondary education or certification at that point. That if they want to be apprentice carpenter or electrician or whatever, that they still have to take geometry, still going to have to take physics, and math and science load. So those discussions need to be there, and I know with looking at the data from Kirkwood, we've done a terrible job with preparing some of our at-risk students for going there, that once they get out of school, they enroll in Kirkwood, find they're not prepared for it, drop out, have debt, and at that point, it's a real challenge, and we've missed that opportunity. And also, I'd like to get a better handle on how do we track students that drop out or leave the system. I mean, they stop showing up at school, but do we do anything to capture any reasons why? Is it they wanted to enter the workforce? What do we have anything that we gather any data on students that just stop showing up at school?
No, because usually if they're not showing up at school, we don't have a way to get hold of them.
So there's no way we don't contact the parents and try and.
Oh, sure we do, but
Okay.
those students we're usually able to bring back in, the ones that disappear out of the system, are the ones that we usually don't have access to.
And I mean, as a member of the equity committee, I can think 4 or 5 things, that I would suggest that the district could look at pre-dropout. Okay, but I guess again, my thinking, Phil, is that to reduce the number of dropouts, the number of kids, and increase the number of kids that graduate and are prepared, that's a thing that would take some deliberate action on the part of the district. And I'm sure, when Matt and Amy and the superintendent, want to engage in this.
The vision of looking at root causes, getting into understanding some of the reasons why, and then put corrective actions in place to prevent
What actions we can take.
So I actually like the task force idea, and I'm not sure, how it gets formed or charted or whatever, and the role of the equity director, and then more of the roles, I don't know how those
Right.
staff positions can support and really contribute heavily to this. But the point around making a more formal process, I think, is really right on. Similar to my comments around the school safety stuff, is that there are so many things that we can and should be doing, but in terms of prioritizing where we think we can have the biggest impact soonest, and then just keep kind of checking things off the list as we work our way through the set of initiatives, I think is really important. So having a kind of more formal way of defining your priorities, making sure that they're the highest impact items, and we get the right resourcing or supports in place to act on those, that we measure the outcomes once we put corrective actions in place, and then continue that loop, and it's going to take years. And so that's why I think having that kind of plan, prioritization, and action planning and measurement is really critical. And we need some mechanism for that, because I feel like we could just, do little bits and pieces across 100 different, areas, but we're not going to have a big impact because we're spreading our resources and energy too broad. It's like spreading peanut butter. I mean, we need to try to take, big impact items first and make a difference there. And so I don't know what that mechanism is, if it's this task force, if it's the staff that you have or will have that can drive some of that with the equity committee or task force. But I think that impulse is important.
I think Paul had an interesting thought process there with involving the School Improvement Advisory Committee, because the School Improvement Advisory Committee has a direct impact on the CSIP process, the Comprehensive School Improvement Plan process. That's something that happens at the building level and in the classroom level, and so there's a direct tie-in with that. It's very linear in the sense that those goals are designed to be driven right down into the classroom, and that classroom impact is where we're going to see some of these changes take place, whether it's programming for students and their planning process, or whether it's the dropout prevention programs that Joan Vandenberger and others are working with in terms of how those are being implemented. So, and I've watched the SIAC committee over time, and their time could be better used. The folks that volunteer for it, I think, are looking for something that has more weight to it, more heft to it. I think I think there's a real opportunity there based on people who volunteered to be on it in the past. That was one of the committees we talked about earlier. We talked about membership formation. It's required by the state. So when you talk about, does it have longevity? Does it have some legs to it? Is it something that's going to be in place over a long period of time? Well, it's required by the state. We have to have a SIAC committee, and so I think there might be some merit in taking it back, and I'd want to talk to Amy and Matt and Diane a little bit more about it, because I know there's some other charges that the SIAC committee has, but I think actually giving them a focus that ties the work that happens in the classroom to graduation rate and dropout rates, which are two kind of different things, the way they measure those, and having the ability to do some of that data disaggregation and track some of that over time, I think helps them inform what they are supposed to do, which is to provide advice to the administration and the board about things that we want to consider for changes in our long-term strategic planning that moves the needle in the classroom.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of good opportunities from, looking at this, and you guys brought up a lot of relevant points. I mean, graduation rates are kind of like the autopsy of, what's happened to their K-12 experience, right? So not too often do we get, not saying it never happens, but that a kid drops out because of what happened to him their senior year. Sometimes that circumstance can present itself, but usually it's, okay, what's led up to that? So when you talk about early intervention or early screening systems, we know credit accumulation in 9th and 10th grade is absolutely critical to graduating on time. And so what's happening in 9th and 10th grade? What courses are they in? How well prepared are they as they enter high school to start accumulating those credits and some of those things? I think the dropout prevention budget that Steve mentioned, we have a large budget that goes to dropout prevention programs. I think looking at evaluating the effectiveness of those programs and kind of the return on investment we're getting in those, I think would be critically important to this work. And then some of the work we've begun, because as you look at a 5-year trend of this, I think it would be interesting to also know when are some of the things we've already talked about, when were they implemented, and how long have we given them to try to see an impact, on their return. When we talk AVID and equal opportunity schools and collapsing tracks of course taking in our secondary system, those are, while we're still talking about not having some data disaggregated appropriately, those are also recent implementations, right? And so when we talk about trying to change that long-term trend, it's evaluating those new ones we have implemented, and then also going back to some of the longer ones we've had and saying, is this really doing what we want it to? And so I think whatever that vehicle is, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to look at that and try to identify what's going on and how do we catch them early in our system, and then looking at the good work that even, Amy at the elementary is doing to close some of those gaps we see in the achievement data all the way through that then lead to, dropouts when we're talking them as high school students.
And I think it's the opportunity to set up some data gathering on the front end too. So one of the things that we're working on right now is developing career pathways for students that are clearly laid out and have coursework articulated right down to the junior high level, so that as a 6th grade student prepares to move into 7th grade and they think about those kinds of things that they're interested in, they've got a better idea of what the course sequencing looks like, not waiting until 9th grade, but all the way from 7th through 12th grade, so that they're appropriately preparing themselves so that they are ready for whatever their chosen career or post-secondary education option is. And that data is something that we do have access to, so we can, as we go through our required by the state career navigation pieces, to then see, okay, what kind of results are we getting in terms of course taking by students based on declared areas of interest? Are they actually, do they understand what's expected of them? Are they taking those courses? If they're not, why aren't they? If they are taking those courses, at what rate are they succeeding? If they're not succeeding, why aren't they succeeding? That data we have access to, and that's that preventative piece, if you will, from a dropout prevention standpoint, is knowing that students that are on track are much more likely to graduate and succeed. So how are we making sure that any deviations from course are corrected early and not after they've magnified themselves to the point that the students have become disengaged?
So when will we get the 17-18 graduation rates? When will that data be available?
We usually share those with you in that annual progress report
Okay.
that we provide in the fall. That's when we have, the best estimate we can give you, and I think, based on the presentation tonight, we'll make sure that's presented in a way that's disaggregated and improve that as well.
Not to criticize you.
Thank you.
No, I think that's good. I mean, I think for us, it's, as Amy and I have worked through that achievement data, we've tried to consistently bring it, but obviously there's still places where we're not doing that and not bringing it all the time, and sometimes that's just, formatting reports, and we just need to continue to update those, so I think it's good to dig in, and I think your point about our Black and African American students is extremely relevant too, because we may be graduating them, but they don't have a path, or, as a group, that path may look a little bit different, and so how are we going beyond just knowing, okay, they've graduated and have a diploma, but then what's happening, and what's that course taking look like, or what's the option look like across the board, so there's several pieces I think we can get into, so I don't know what you guys want to do for a vehicle from that, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to dig into that and look at that as a system and try to evaluate some of those dropout prevention programs we have.
And I was listening to every time you guys came to talk to us. Pretty much at every one, right? You pointed out parts of the equity plan that needed some updating, and I know in the moment and even afterwards, it's almost like, all right, who's going to do that, right? And it really crystallized to me actually at a work training that had nothing to do with this, but somebody had said the line, if a problem is everybody's problem, it's nobody's problem. And I like the idea of having a specific task force, or at least a specific group of people that actually, that's part of their charge, right, to do it. Because I think it just won't get done if everybody's waiting for somebody else to do it. So I like that part. And I will echo Paul, because I also served on the SIAC 1 year, and I think it might be a good vehicle to do this. I mean, one of the other things that you put out at every meeting was looking at everything through an equity lens. And we're going to talk about school improvement. I think it should have an equity lens there. So it seems like a proper vehicle there. And I know when I went to the one meeting that I had when I served on that committee, it was a one-time deal. I was expecting a heavier lift, like a little more deep thing. And there was some data presented, and we kind of had a little conversation at the table. And we're like, all right, that was fun. And that was kind of the end of it. So I think the people who are wanting to serve on that committee are willing to do that work, at least most of them, I guess. I'd be a little more targeted on that maybe, but I think that may be a good vehicle.
So that sounds like a clear action item for discussion on the 11th around the SIAC and its charter, and maybe in that discussion we can talk about it pivoting a bit to cover the equity lens around school improvement and dropout prevention and that sort of thing. Does that sound?
We can definitely bring that back to you. And like I said, I'll want to talk to Amy and Diane and Matt a little bit more just to make sure that we're not putting too much on them, or that it's too singularly focused given some of the other things that they're required to do by the state. But we can definitely come back to you.
Yeah,
and,
well, I don't want it to be,
yeah.
that's to be the sole focus of
Right.
that committee. I think that's just,
Right.
that committee could do a lot of this.
They could, yeah.
So I'm also thinking, just listening to this, that updating the comprehensive equity plan and expanding the function of the ISEP, or whatever it's called. SIAC committee may not be the same thing.
Right,
Could
there
be.
may be some overlap, but I was thinking the same thing, that there's some things I think that might be different that wouldn't be comprehensive school improvement plan related. So if it'd be all right with you, what I'd like to do is kind of go back and look at what that Venn diagram looks like, have some conversation with the committee about where there may or may not be overlap, and then what, for those things that are not part of what might be their charge, then what might be the best tactic to figure out how to keep those things moving forward.
Yeah, I just, so Lisa, I don't want to waste your time since you're here, but to talk about this, so maybe explain to folks why somebody on an IEP is not going to graduate in 5 years, because I think that probably informs some of our data. If you can be served till you're 21, that could be a very successful transition for that family and that student, but that's going to lower a 5 or 4 year graduation rate. But then I do wonder what happened. I mean, that's a pretty big anomaly in 15, 16, so I don't know. One, is that just a low number of, was the cohort very small, and so 1 or 2 or 4 kids could throw that?
We did have the numbers, which we didn't include in the data here. In 15, 16, the number of students in those graphs was 26. as opposed to the other years when it's 100 or so.
So,
So
there
there's
you go.
some, but why was it 26 in those years? Why was it?
So that would be a question, you know, why did the number dip? But obviously, if your N is 26, then it's not going to take too many kids. But truthfully, right, special ed kids can be served till they're 21. And usually families in that situation want that service up until 21. That's not kind of, is that?
Yes, sometimes there's a small difference in the number of students who potentially could graduate at 4 or 5 year interval, and who actually do because their team has planned it that way all along, for good reasons, because they want to do extra transition readiness and that sort of thing. However, that does not explain the number that we have. I mean, we want more students to graduate between that 4 or at least 5 year window. Because if they don't, sometimes then we lose them. They won't come back, you know, after that. So most students with an IEP could and probably should graduate with the 4 or 5 year cohort, unless their team has planned it intentionally that they would stay in school. And that accounts for a small number, but not that many. I mean, but this is already on our radar. It's something that we're already planning to address, and we in the special ed department and every other department want that number to be improved.
What, can you just say what maybe, is it 1 or 2% a year? So these are pretty dramatic differences from the other kids. So on average, the kids who might be on at 21, is that like 1 or 2%? Is it that small?
Maybe, I mean, I'd have to really look at that number, but it's, you know, probably not more than a few percent of students. And, you know, the course of study and the potential graduation date for IEP students, those are IEP team discussions, and in some cases, IEP team decisions as to, you know, the specific adjustments, modifications to coursework and that sort of thing. So we want the team decisions to remain team decisions, whether or not it influences our bottom line numbers. But those aren't the cases that we're worried about. The cases that we're worried about would be students who are just underperforming in coursework and maybe don't have all the services that they need from general educators or special educators, or just our system in order to graduate on time when they really could and should. So.
Thank you for the update and presentation and thought process. I think we have a good couple action items coming out of the conversation tonight, that we'll have a follow-up conversation for the 9/11 board meeting. And so I might shift this to the next item around the equity committee's recommendations and comments on the accelerated, the Competency master plan. And so, again, I want to thank the committee for preparing this. I thought it was very well done, succinct, clear, actionable, which I appreciate. And so I don't know if there's any other comments Charlie or the team would like to make, or we'd like to open it up to comment from board members.
I just want to say generally, I think that the committee who looked at the AMP generally are supporting the board's efforts to do parent schooling. We never do anything categorically. But generally, we're supporting it.
Charlie, could you talk a bit more about how you come to that recommendation?
The recommendations that we sent to you.
No, the paired schools versus boundary changes.
I don't think we talked about a difference between paired schools and boundary changes.
That your approach is generally paired schools, if I heard you correctly?
I guess I was trying to say that since the board is interested in paired schools, we were trying to come up with
Okay, so it's not that that's your recommendation versus boundary changes.
You're trying to trick me here or
Yeah,
something?
I misunderstood it, so I want to make sure I have it correctly.
Well, on our last meeting, what we focused on, as we had heard that this would be an option, so we focused on preparing some, if this is the course that the board would like to take, then these are some ideas to think about. going on forward, making sure it's implemented. If this is the way, if this is what's gonna be implemented, keep this in mind while implementing it, if that makes sense.
And when Charlie sent these out to us earlier, beforehand, I had a back and forth email with him on a couple points that, and I think he cleared up. You know, I was concerned that preparation point number 4, that the equity committee may have wanted to have a hand on who gets what students in what classroom, so he was clear. You know, I definitely would love, wanted that to stay with the principals and teachers, as they knew best the kids there, but I understand the point that he sent back to me, and I also was appreciative of point number 5 in preparation, that I think that if we pair a school, I don't believe that we should look to necessarily strip away the RAM staffing levels either until we figure out what happens with that school going forward, because you still have the same kids that we're educating, it's just in a different makeup, so I appreciated that point.
Sorry, the financial guys are not going to appreciate that.
I'm more concerned with student outcomes than I am with
Exactly, we
finances.
want this to work and achieve the outcomes that we're looking for, right? Equity, student achievement, balance, fairness, when you talk a lot about fairness, JP. If we don't pay attention to these kinds of dimensions of our work, cultural work, readiness, preparation, making sure the schools are ready for whatever change is coming, the community, families, parents are ready and engaged for the change that's coming. It's not gonna work. We can move kids, we can pair schools, we can change boundaries, but it's not gonna achieve the outcomes we want if we don't pay attention to these kinds of things. So I really appreciate that, again, the preparation of that presentation of these items.
Well, we may want to note that perhaps the largest reservation on the part of the committee discussion was making preparation, trying to do as much as can be done by the administration, the teaching staff, and staff at schools to enhance the cultural competency of the paired school that has less kids of color in it now.
So let me question, and we do need to do that, and so right now, what we're doing, I think one of the main things we're doing for cultural competency is implicit bias training, right? That's one of our, what did I say, that's the heavy lift right now. And so I think a couple points. One, to make sure, and I hope that our staff understand that it's not check the box. It's not a one and done, that is a constant, we're constantly doing that. We don't just do the training and now all of a sudden everybody's culturally competent, we don't have implicit bias. That's an ongoing process, and maybe to that end, we have some phase 2, phase 3, so that we continue. But then we need to, and I know this, that we really do have to focus on those schools that currently have a pretty low FRL. That those are schools that struggle the most with. They haven't had to deal with a lot of different kinds of things. It hasn't come to their fore, and I think our data probably show that out, that that's maybe our areas to focus on. So obviously we would want to bump those up or make sure we dig in deeper to those schools to make sure that we're not, I think the comment I heard at one point was, people really don't want to send kids where they're not welcome and where they're not going to be loved and they're not going to be embraced, and that's a real fear. And indeed that people have seen that behavior from, unfortunately, and again, this is implicit, right? People aren't going out intending to do these things. But that is, in our student climate survey data shows that we have this issue all over the district, that the experience of students is very different than what our intention is. And so I think we need to be very careful that we're moving along those tracks with our staff and with our community, that we understand kind of where the things come from. And I'm optimistic. I've talked to enough people who have had the experience of moving from a less diverse place to a more diverse place, and I haven't had too many people for whom that's been a negative experience. Most people say, I never knew how great this was for my kid. This has really changed kind of the way we see things, and I know that's been my experience, just my daughter's experience. So So I'm confident that once we start doing this, that helps as a catalyst for some real change. But at the same time, I don't think we can be naive that we need to do some front loading to make sure we're as prepared as we can possibly be. So I really appreciate this, and you raised some more things, right? Obviously, we're talking about and FRL, right? And really, that's the only way we can dice this up. We can't really do it by race, but obviously that plays a role. And so we need to be cognizant when we're assigning kids and looking at classrooms. Yeah, that one, when we make this switch, one teacher gets all minority. We're not front loading that. So these are some really good points to think about.
On that specific point, I guess it's been pointed out to me that it's in some instances, some situations, and obviously, and the assistant Amy will be involved with this. In some situations, it may be advantageous for the school to have more minority kids in some classrooms than in other classrooms. That was pointed out to me, so it's one of the reasons why we're.
Well, at the end of the day, I think, I hope the board, we're not going to get involved at that level, right? I trust our staff to know their buildings and our principals to know their folks. I would imagine, Amy, and tell me if this is probably true. Well, obviously, we're going to have to mix staff around if we do a paired school, it's K2. But is there anything beyond that we might, is there more that would need to be done to help support those staffs, certain personnel that we can move in to provide extra support?
Well, I definitely think some of the recommendations that are on the sheet are really good ones around the cultural proficiency. A lot of those things we already have in place. It's just thinking about how early to start those conversations again with staff. Who's had the training, who hasn't. Everybody's at least at different training points too. We're in year 3 of the implicit bias project, so we should feel like we're pretty good there. We do need to go back, I think, just and visit cultural proficiency in general and talk about the continuum again. As our buildings are bringing on, for instance, new ELL programs, the building principals have done a good job of getting their teachers out to PSYOP trainings or on top of that doing different book studies. So I think if and when a decision is made, all of that kind of professional development stuff is key and critical. Typically, what our building principals and teaching staffs like to do is try to balance demographically as best as possible across the classroom. So Charlie brings up an interesting point about does it make sense in certain cases to maybe have a bigger cluster of a certain group of students together, maybe for a level of comfort or for not. We kind of debate that in education, whether we should be doing that, whether for the special education students to best get served that way. So I think the research would, like many things in education, you can find research that supports it and then doesn't, and looks like it's
Good, thank you very much for that. So moving to the next topic is some building block options. You're welcome to stay, but I understand that you have commitments and functions to get to.
Sure. I used to have way more ideas.
We had a reverb running through our house.
Oh, good luck with all of that. Thank you all so much for taking your time tonight. Mr. Murley.
All right, so there were several requests. Option 1 was, could we consider leaving Breckenridge where it sits, which for the 1920, or 1819 rather, the 1920 revisions to the maps. This says 1819, that's 1920. It's the maps over here. Right? Am I doing that right? So that's
1920.
Yeah. Sorry about that. But could we consider leaving Breckenridge at Lemmy, which is different than what's on the map there, and then move Lemmy east, which was an area that was identified from geographic divisions on roads, to Hoover, so we could balance those numbers. Option 2 was, could we consider moving Forest Ridge back to Man? Forest Ridge is at Man, so in a sense would it stay? And then could we consider moving Lake Ridge to Lincoln? And that's because Forest View was assigned to Lincoln in the new versions. And then option 3 was, given the new classrooms that were created at Longfellow, could we consider moving Lake Ridge into Longfellow? And then the fourth one was, could we consider moving Boston Way to Borlaug? So What you have in that attachment there, coupled with the maps, are what the demographics look like. So this first one is what Lemmy would look like if it retained Breckenridge, and what Hoover would look like if this area that is up here in the corner, you see those little dots up there, if those kids were moved into the new Hoover attendance area. So those are the demographics that you have there. K-6 kids on the left side, pre-K-6 kids over on the right side. Again, these are live-in data, so this shows students where they currently live. I'm going to rifle through this unless you folks have questions as you're going along, stop me. Again, here's the numbers for Man, Lincoln, and Alexander. And again, you've got numbers for Man because it's retaining at Forest View. There's the new map for that. You've got numbers for Lincoln because they are losing Forest View. In this case, they're also adding Lake Ridge, which is down here. So you get a new set of numbers for Lincoln. And you get a new set of numbers for Alexander because Alexander loses Lake Ridge. So that shows you what those numbers look like, because Alexander, again, if you refer to the map over here, was supposed to get Lake Ridge with that new map version. Option 3 was moving Lake Ridge to Longfellow. So this is what the new map would look like. Here's your new numbers for Longfellow with the addition of Lake Ridge. And again, Alexander would be losing Lake Ridge, so that shows you the numbers. And again, here's Alexander absent Lake Ridge. And then the final one was moving Boston Way to Borlaug. So Boston Way is this area up here. And then that shows you also the numbers for Kirkwood, because Boston Way is currently assigned to Kirkwood. And you see over here the new line on the west side of the Kirkwood attendance area, and that gives you the new numbers for Kirkwood.
Questions, comments?
I mean, Lake Ridge, I mean, I think that moving, because Alexander, I think, has been, for me, one of the hardest things to think about getting at, and that really brings that number down significantly. You know, I prefer, I think looking at this, I prefer moving them to Lincoln. Since we're talking about pairing Longfellow and Twain as a way to kind of touch on Longfellow, you know, Lincoln is one of those schools that we don't really touch any other way, and I think, and I've said this before, kind of our schools, I don't, you know, I talk about fairness, I don't think it's fair to leave anybody on any extreme to untouch those. I think that if we're going to do this in the interest of equity, we got to find a way to get a Lincoln that's not in here. I think, and then that's where I'm worried about Forest View not having this big of a demographic shift as we kind of move forward, and that Forest View ceases to exist, and those folks are moving to other parts of town. So to me, that looks like a way we can sort of start bringing those, our most extreme schools closer to our middle. And I don't know another way to do that with Lincoln.
But Lincoln's numbers with Forest View there go the other way. They go to the middle.
They do, but how long is it going to last if Forest View isn't going to have that, it's not going to have low-income population? And I know that we don't know that, and it may not be 1 or 2 years, but I mean, I think, you know, I've anecdotally heard that Alexander actually is looking at some shifts, because some housing down there, it might start to change those numbers. And so that's what I worry about Forest View, is that we make these shifts, and then the demographics change, which obviously we can't control where people live and where developments go. Then have we done all this work, and we kind of get right back to where we started. And that's and I don't know, I think the difference between taking Lake Ridge to Longfellow or Lincoln, I don't know that it's a whole lot further or even further necessarily. I don't know. If we have that, is that?
I mean, I guess my issue would be time on the bus.
According to
Well,
Google
sure.
Maps, it's 3.4 miles to Longfellow and 3.6 miles to Lincoln, and it's 3.2 miles, I believe, to Twain, where they're at now. And it would be 2.7 to Alexander. I just looked.
What I'm saying is the route there.
How long?
Would be going through Riverside Drive at 8 o'clock, before 8 o'clock time, so I'm just saying. the roads at the
Yeah.
beginning is going to be different.
Yeah.
Well, can we make sure that, I would assume that's from like the operations end, like that's a question we can make sure we get answered, is time on the bus? Because obviously, that's something I'm concerned,
Yeah, they probably have to give you an approximation, because I don't think we run any buses along those routes right now, so they
Okay,
might not be able to give you a real specific amount of time on the bus.
Okay.
Usually we get that from Durham, when they've got a pretty good handle on it, because they're already running buses along those routes. Just even get an estimate.
I guess my only other point would be that if they did end up at Longfellow and Twain were the paired schools, then you may be moving them for 1 year away from some of their
I know.
peers, but then they're gonna be rebanded.
That's what I was wondering what
That's-
that looks like after.
Yeah.
That's a concern too.
And that would be similar if we went ahead with the pairing of Kirkwood and Borlaug, same thing with those Kirkwood kids, Borlaug. That would be similar.
So again, I think as you go through this, if you've got other either building blocks that you'd like us to look at, we'd be happy to run those. I think that gives you a good library as we're moving forward, so that as we get into this a little bit further and you want to look back, it gives us that opportunity to look at that data set without having to bring it forward to you next time. So these are things that we'll continue to retain. Obviously, you have access to in board docs. We'd be more than happy to run any other scenarios like this as you go through there, just to make sure that you've got that data available to you.
And then also, I think, like, these are, some of these building blocks that we're talking about are things that we need to keep in mind and decide for the 2019. I mean, when do you need to know that by? Soon, right? I mean, we may not get paired schools are more likely to be longer term outlook where these situations need to be resolved. So,
And as I've gone out and talked to different groups, right, one of the things that comes up almost every time is the balance that we've been trying to do the whole time of balancing that sense of urgency of needing something done and needing something done right. And I think, we've talked about, are there things that we can do faster that are going to have a positive impact? And there are things that will be sustainable for the long term that will also have positive impacts. And I think that's why these are, kind of got to look at them slightly removed from pairing. But at some point, if pairing is going to happen, you can't undo what you just did either. So you got to look at them hand in hand. That's my tangent, but my real question that actually pertains to the numbers, what does that number look like at Borlaug? I don't have a good sense, because that's the one where you just kind of move in a chunk in, not having anybody go out, and it's a pretty good total of kids there, but I don't really remember the capacity of Borlaug.
Oh, you mean what does it look like compared to capacity?
Well, in a lot of the other options there, we have kids moving into a place and then another set moving out, and the numbers are not changing, but in option 4 here, you got Boston Wade going to Borlaug, and nobody's leaving it.
Well, and actually, Borlaug was a surprise a bit to us this year. We were really good, literally under a percentage point in terms of where assignments were. We literally got down to 7 teachers that, should they be here, should they be there? 2 of them were at Borlaug this year. So what the projections had for Borlaug in the spring undercounted the number of students in the building by 2 FTE this year. So I would say that I don't know if I can answer that question because it deviated from course this fall.
And on
What
the
is
flip
capacity
side,
of Borlaug?
and on the flip side, Horn.
Correct. Yeah, Horn wound up being two teachers below projections literally from May.
And that loss, was that from students moving away or open enrolling or? Moving away, okay.
Kind of to Sean's point, excuse me, and it kind of came out with the equity committee. I think a lot of people in the community are thinking we're putting all of our hopes just on pairing. And I know we had a discussion at Southeast where we were talking short-term, middle term, and long-term things. So I think it's important that we're looking at all those things and the curriculum be part of that discussion and things that way as well. And I'm reminded, and I'm starting to get some emails from people in the community concerned that when the district proposed the idea of eliminating smaller schools and replacing them with larger elementary schools, it didn't go very well. And when we're pairing, we're de facto making large elementary schools. And I'm just putting that out there because that's something that I'm starting to hear from the community.
Although, Phil,
That way.
when we get operational efficiency,
Yeah,
this is the way some of the small schools stay open.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm just putting that out there. When you take two middles, when you take two smalls and put them together, you make a nice operational happy size. But when you start getting into larger schools and pairing those, then you start getting into 600-700 class size. That's I'm just putting that out there.
Going back to Sean's question about capacity for Borlaug, I just wanted to point out, going on the 17-18 numbers for live-in, enroll, transfer out, there's 46 transfers last year that were transferring into Borlaug. Are those kids still there this year?
I'd have to go back and research that, but the last 2 years we have returners to Borlaug, and then each year with our returners, we look at if there's space, and we certainly had to deny some returners.
And there's 551 seats listed for Borlaug, so.
So I think at one point I had heard 70 kids from Boston Way, although I'm not sure, isn't it just one bus that goes to Boston Way?
I'd have to look.
One bus, so that would be, what, 40 kids?
Not everybody rides the bus.
Yeah.
Okay.
But looking at the numbers, it must be about 70.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Okay, I was
I'm
thinking
pretty sure it's
70 at
7.
one point, so, you know, I'm just pointing out that if we do the change to the voluntary transfer rule, then that would free up some seats at Borlaug.
What's capacity for Borlaug?
551.
550.
And interestingly enough, 23 of those kids are from Kirkwood that are at Borlaug.
So they are.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that they live in Boston Way.
But that is interesting.
Yeah.
Keep in mind capacity too, I'm sure that includes a special education room,
Yeah.
and there's quite a few programs at Borlaug, so
Right.
there's not really capacity for 550. That way, depending on which of the programs it would be.
So like I said, as you go through, when you think of either building blocks or those other data points that you need, please let us know. We'll run those for you. We'll bring them here so that you can talk about them. We'll put them in the library. That way, when we need access to them, hopefully we have as many of your questions asked and answered and ready to go as you need. So when you get to the decision-making standpoint, you've got the data you need.
So let me just ask with this, just on this Kirkwood Borlaug. So I would like to see, because I know when we start looking at, it's a little bit easier to find pockets of poverty or pockets of high FRL. It's not as easy to find a pocket of non-FRL. That it's not quite as neat to just take a neighborhood and get these changes. But I guess I would like to see, hypothetically, say we get rid of voluntary transfer. So what's that do at Kirkwood as far as kids there? And then are there neighborhoods, or is there a way we could, because when I look at this number 568 in a school that's 551, that has special programming. That's concerning. I think it's just hard to move kids in if you're not.
One of the things we're going to bring forward to you, and with the flip-flop in the organizational meeting, we'll bring it to you on the 25th, is impact for voluntary transfer. Okay. So you're going to see all of those numbers, and hopefully that you'll be able to visualize a little bit better if there were no voluntary transfers, what would the population look like? We'll do a complete live-in analysis for you when you look at that. So keep in mind there are things that you're probably going to want to talk about as a board. What about sixth graders, things like that. So you won't see that in there because we don't want to make assumptions about that. We're just going to bring you the pure live-in numbers. But I think that'll help you better understand, back to the comment about who's where and what kind of seats are actually available. You'll be able to see what that would look like given the what the certified enrollment counts were last October 1st, and then what we project for attendance areas for 19-20 without any changes. Here's what it would look like.
Yeah, I think
So you'll be able to see
that's
that.
a really, really important next step.
Yep.
before we get into making.
And we'll get that out to you
decisions
well
on
in advance of that
graduates.
meeting on the 25th. I've got a lot of that information already compiled, so
Yeah.
hopefully here within the next week or so, that'll actually be done. Because I was thinking we were going to need it for the 11th, so we'll have it probably a couple weeks in advance, so you'll be able to take a look at it. If there's anything in there that you see that you need additional information on, we'll have some lead time so we can get that ready for you.
All right, that's good. Thank you.
Amy, can I just ask real quick? So you said horn numbers are down,
Yeah.
like significantly now?
Significantly.
Yeah, particular grade levels, I think fourth and sixth grade come to mind.
Yeah.
In particular, just from what we had May rolling up to the next grade level, significant.
And the only reason I bring that up is because it was 2015, maybe we moved kids from there to Weber that
Mhm.
were pretty
Yep.
concerned about wanting to stay at Horn. So I mean, that's just, in my head, I was
Yeah.
going,
We talked about that.
Talk to Rich about who these families are, where they're going, are they attached to the university, going back home, that kind of thing. So we try to figure out. We've seen it happen, I think, the last 2 years, but this year was dramatic.
Yeah, Matt and I met with the Center for Worker Justice and had some conversations about what else might be impacting movement of students in our community. I think there's a lot of things that are happening with our immigrant population that are invisible to the rest of us. They shared some things that were happening in other parts of the state that, to be honest with you, I think Matt and I were both unaware of it until they walked us through some of the things that are going on out there and the impact that that might have on people's residency and who we may be losing. So we don't know that yet, but that's one of the things when we start getting our data and we can disaggregate it, we want to make sure that we're taking a look at that too, because that was some concern. As soon as Amy and I started looking at where do we see movement in or out that was unanticipated, then we start trying to determine what might be the causation for that. So.
I'm wondering if Lake Ridge did go to Lincoln, then would there be a building block that you could recommend to be moved out of potentially Alexander or Wood to go to Longfellow instead of Lake Ridge?
If it's paired, certainly, because if you think about the way the attendance map looks, let me stand over here so I'm not just thinking in my own head here. So if you look at the way the attendance areas are set up, so if you're talking about a pairing, keep in mind Alexander and Wood are right on the south side of the Twain boundary here. For those of you that, and I remember this because you mentioned it before, so think geographically here. So we're thinking about the Broadway neighborhood down here. That's right along the north side here. And so if you think about some of those areas that are on the north end of the Alexander attendance area or on the northwest side of the Wood attendance area, certainly if those were part of the Twain attendance area, which was then paired with Longfellow, that would be one way to think about how you may want to make some transition. So that would be my immediate reaction to that if we're looking at it in the full scope of things.
So I would be interested to see that, a building block with maybe, I don't know if
Sure.
it would be separate, you take the Wood group, you take the Alexander group,
Sure.
and play around with it a little bit, but I would be interested to see those kids going to Longfellow, since we're talking pairing anyway.
I'd look at it from two different perspectives. So when I sit down and we're inside Guide K-12 and we're looking at that, I think there's some naturally occurring neighborhoods, but do you have a size in mind as we start to look at that?
I think it would depend on what the
Okay.
capacity
All right.
allows.
All right.
I mean, obviously, Alexander is bursting at the seams, so they can afford to lose some students. Longfellow's going to have some open seats with their expansion.
Sure.
Also, by the way, side note, getting Alexander down to 59% by moving Lake Ridge is really, I think, something that's significant. Because by the 2019 boundaries that we have at this point,
So
there's like 79%.
yeah. So keep in mind, right? Those are our live-in kids too. We have a lot of transfers out of Alexander.
Yeah.
So I think another thing for us to keep in mind long-term is if voluntary transfer, and you'll see this when we meet on the 25th, if we take voluntary transfer away, you are automatically going to see an increase in the population of students at Alexander Elementary School because you're going to get the move-outs or the enroll-outs are going to come back. And so you're going to get a bit of a bump there to start with.
So it would make sense then to move a group out Lake Ridge being one, maybe move another group out as well into
Yeah.
Longfellow.
And actually, I'll try to see if I can ramp that up and get some of it out to you quicker, because it may spur your thinking, because as you see kind of the heat mapped index of who gets a lot of students moving out and who has a lot of students moving in, that might influence some of this conversation.
It may influence what the building blocks are.
Right, that's what I'm thinking.
So I really think that we need to see
Yeah.
that voluntary transfer change.
Yep.
As a baseline
Yep.
for us then to figure out what are the.
We'll try to get you that data as quick as possible.
One other thing I would be interested in, I don't know if this is operations or we'll just have to look it up on our own, but for parents to get from Lake Ridge to Lincoln, is there, to get from Lake Ridge to Longfellow, you're more likely to have public transportation.
Oh, I didn't even look at the public transportation. Public transportation of Lincoln.
So according to what I've heard from the
Yeah.
neighborhood centers in Johnson County,
Give me a
and
couple
of course
blocks
we
away.
can't make any generalizations, but according to what they've told me, the Lake Ridge area tends to be an area that have transportation, they have cars.
Did you just get kicked off the
Because they're kind
server?
of far out.
Plus those buses out there, not car.
Was that?
I don't even, does the bus go to Lake Ridge?
Is that their server? Or
Oh, I'm sure it does.
Did you just sit idle for too long? Well, that's pretty far
Oh.
south. Because if you go past
You
that,
seen the
the
pilot
bus
plane?
does not go out
Huh?
to
You're saying I'm a pilot?
even places within the city limits much. Doesn't go out to Fairtown. It doesn't go to Lake Ridge.
Anything else on this topic?
I just make a point on the option one, because I'm only looking at it as what it looks like after doing it, right? And the numbers all look good, and I'm all for keeping kids at a school that they're already at and not moving them if, if we can do that. I'm just wondering, what kind of change is that from what it?
So interestingly, the size of those building blocks is almost identical. So the number of students that are in Breckenridge right now that would remain at Lemmy and not transition to the new Hoover is almost identical to the size of that population from that area bounded by those two roads, north and south and east and west. It's almost, that population of students is almost identical to the Breckenridge population. So it was literally an even swap.
Total count.
Right, so Lemmy stays the same, Hoover stays the same as to what it would be in 1920, it's just different kids.
Demographically, their FRL last year was 28.7%. And this would put them at 28.2%.
Right, so they're essentially keeping the same kids minus a
They're keeping kids and not.
Right.
Take them out and lowers their FRL.
Right.
Whereas Hoover, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I thought that was around 45, 47-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be an improvement for him.
All right. And the last thing I've got for you tonight, there's a request to better understand where current Hoover sits in relation to the other schools. So this is, just so you better understand how this map works, what it does is it measures not by the crow flies, but as your car drives. And so that's why you have these, I don't know what you call them, these geometric shapes that are on there. So it's based on traffic patterns. So here's current Hoover as it sits. This kind of tan set of blocks are the within 1 mile, so you have Longfellow and Lucas. And then the yellow are the 2 mile streets. So you've got Mann, Lemmy, Twain, and Wood is, you can't see it because of the way that the school sits on top of it, but it's just inside that 2 mile radius by drive to Hoover.
So I asked for that, and I guess my thinking was if we did a pairing of Longfellow and Twain, so you now have one neighborhood school, 2 campuses, basically. I just wanted to make sure that some of those kids that were at Hoover, when they were going to Twain, would not be outside the busing, where we'd have to provide busing if we could send them somewhere where they didn't have to be bused.
Sure. So if you get any others like this that you want us to run, Adam and I were busy working with the RJF software, and we have a process for running these now, so the first one was a little difficult, but any future ones would be much easier. So if you need anything more like this, you can run this fairly easily for you.
Does this answer your question, Paul?
Sort of, not really. I mean, I'd have to overlay the other map on top of that
Yeah.
to see what it would look like. I mean, I don't know which
Yeah.
areas in
Where the
there.
Hoover boundary is compared to the two on the.
Yeah.
So at some point, if you and I just want to sit down, and we might bring Adam in and better explain what we're looking for, and I think that's something that he can do fairly easily.
Yeah, because I think, you know, when you look at this area in here, where Hoover is,
Right.
I mean, this is kind of the boundary. Everybody else is going that way, and these students are going this way to Longfellow. So now if you're going down here to Twain, that's a little bit.
Sure. Yep.